I should have left the moment he didn't show up, but instead I stayed sitting there pretending the melting ice in my glass didn't feel like a countdown to my own embarrassment. The restaurant was too nice for someone like me. Soft jazz floating through the air, waiters moving like they had rehearsed every step, the kind of place where people didn't get stood up, at least not publicly, not like this. I checked my phone again even though I knew there wouldn't be anything new. No apology, no excuse, just silence. 30 minutes late turned into 45 and then an hour, and with every passing minute I felt smaller, like the room was quietly deciding what I was worth, and finding it lacking. I told myself to stand up, to leave, to walk out with whatever dignity I had left, but my body wouldn't listen, because leaving meant admitting I had been waiting for someone who didn't think I was worth showing up for, and that hurt more than staying. Emily, the voice hit me before I saw him, and my stomach dropped. In a way that had nothing to do with hunger. Jason Blake stood there like he owned the space, like he hadn't spent the last year teaching me exactly how disposable I was. His smile was the same practiced, effortless thing that used to make me believe in promises that never came true. Didn't expect to see you here, he said, sliding into the chair across from me like it had always been his, like I had always been his. I didn't invite him, I didn't say anything, I just stared at him and felt that old familiar tension crawl up my spine, the one that made me second-guess everything I was about to say. Let me guess. He leaned back, glancing at the empty seat beside me. He didn't show, huh? I swallowed hard, forcing my voice to stay steady. It's none of your business. He laughed under his breath like I'd just confirmed something amusing. Still picking the wrong guys, Emily, you always had a talent for that. Around us I could feel eyes pretending not to look, conversations lowering just enough for people to listen, and suddenly it wasn't just a bad night, it was a performance, and I was the main act. You don't get to comment on my choices, I said quietly, but my hands were betraying me, fingers tightening around the edge of the table like it was the only thing keeping me grounded. Jason leaned forward, resting his elbows casually like we were catching up over coffee, like he hadn't been the reason I learned how to hide disappointment behind a polite smile. Come on, don't be like that, you look ridiculous sitting here alone. The word ridiculous echoed louder than it should have, and for a second I almost believed him, almost stood up just to escape the weight of it all. But then something shifted, not loud, not obvious, just a subtle change in the air, like the room had taken a breath and was holding it. I didn't notice the man at first, not really, just a presence behind Jason, tall, still, composed in a way that didn't ask for attention but somehow commanded it anyway. Jason noticed, though I saw it in the way his posture changed just slightly, like his confidence had found a crack. You're in my seat. The voice was calm, low, controlled, not raised, not rushed, just certain, and something about it made the space around us go completely still. Jason blinked like he wasn't used to being interrupted, like he didn't recognize what was happening. Excuse me, he said, turning halfway, but the man didn't repeat himself, didn't need to. He simply stood there waiting, and somehow that was worse than anger, worse than confrontation. It was expectation, pure and simple, like the outcome had already been decided and Jason just hadn't caught up yet. I looked up, then really looked, and for the first time that night I forgot about the empty chair, forgot about the messages that never came, forgot about Jason completely, because the man standing beside our table didn't feel like part of my world at all. He felt like something else, something precise, something deliberate, something that didn't waste words or moments. And when his eyes met mine briefly before returning to Jason, I felt something shift inside me too, not fear, not exactly, something steadier than that, something that whispered I wasn't the smallest person in the room anymore. Jason hesitated for half a second, and that was all it took for the illusion he carried to start cracking, because confidence only works when nobody challenges it, and the man standing beside him did not look like someone who had ever been challenged in his life. I said, you're in my seat, he repeated, but softer this time, almost like he was offering Jason a choice instead of giving an order, and somehow that made it worse. I watched Jason's jaw tighten the way it always did when he felt cornered, when he realized control was slipping through his fingers. We are in the middle of something, Jason replied, trying to sound annoyed, trying to sound like he still owned the moment, but there was a thin edge in his voice now, something uncertain, something I had never heard from him before. The man did not respond right away. He simply looked at Jason, not angry, not impatient, just looking like he was measuring him against a standard Jason did not even know existed. And then he reached forward, not aggressively, not forcefully, just enough to rest his hand lightly on the back of Jason's chair, and that small movement changed everything. Because suddenly it was clear the chair did not belong to Jason. It never had. The silence stretched long enough that even the music in the background felt like it had stepped back to watch. Stand up, he said, and this time it was not a suggestion. Jason let out a short laugh. Like he could shake this off like it was all some misunderstanding. "You do not get to tell me what to do, man. You do not even know who I am." The man tilted his head slightly, considering that like it might have mattered, like it might have changed something, but it did not. "You are right," he said calmly. "I do not need to." There was no threat in his voice, no raised tone, no dramatic gesture, just certainty, clean and simple. And for the first time since I had known him, Jason looked unsure, really unsure, not the kind he could cover with a joke or a smirk, but the kind that made him glance around, like he was searching for backup that was not coming. "Emily, let us just go," Jason said quickly, shifting his attention back to me, like I was still something he could control, like I was still part of his exit strategy. His hand reached toward mine, and instinctively I pulled back, not fast, not dramatic, just enough to create space, and that small movement felt louder than anything that had been said all night. The man noticed. I saw it in the brief flicker of his eyes, the way he registered the distance I created, like it confirmed something he had already suspected. "She is not going anywhere with you," he said, still calm, still steady, but now there was something else underneath it, something firmer, something that did not leave room for negotiation. Jason straightened up, pushing his chair back with a little more force than necessary, like he was trying to reclaim ground he had already lost. "And who exactly are you to decide that?" he asked, and for a moment the man did not answer. He simply stepped forward, closing the distance just enough that Jason had to lean back slightly to keep space between them, and that was it. That was the moment everything shifted, because power is not always loud. Sometimes it is just the way someone stands, the way they look at you, like the outcome has already been written and you are just catching up. "Adrian," he said finally, like a name was all that was required, like it carried weight on its own, and judging by the way one of the waiters froze mid-step a few feet away, it did. Jason swallowed. I actually saw it happen, the confident, easy version of him slipping further away with every second. "Look, Adrian, we are just talking here, no need to make it a thing," he said softer now, adjusting his tone, adjusting himself, trying to find footing on ground that was no longer stable. Adrian did not move, did not blink, did not soften. "You already made it a thing when you sat down," he replied, and then after a brief pause he added, "Now you can stand up and leave, or you can continue embarrassing yourself in a place that does not belong to you." The words were not harsh, they were not loud, but they landed heavier than anything shouted could have, and for the first time that night I saw Jason step back, not physically at first, but mentally, like he was retreating from a fight he could not win. And as he slowly rose from the chair I realized something else, something that settled deep in my chest like a quiet truth I had not allowed myself to believe before. I had not been waiting because I deserved to be left. I had been waiting because I had not yet learned when to stand up myself. And now, watching Jason move aside under the weight of someone else's certainty, I felt something shift inside me, something steadier, something stronger, something that whispered I did not need to be chosen by people who could not even show up. Jason lingered for a moment, like he was deciding whether to say something else, something sharp enough to salvage what little pride he had left, but whatever he saw in Adrian's expression must have changed his mind, because instead he gave me one last look, a mixture of frustration and disbelief, like he could not understand how the situation had slipped so completely out of his control. "This is not over, Emily," he muttered under his breath before turning away, his steps quicker than usual, not quite a retreat but close enough, and as he disappeared into the low hum of the restaurant I felt the tension in my shoulders slowly begin to release, like I had been holding a breath for far too long and only just realized it. Adrian did not watch him leave for long, just a brief glance to confirm the outcome before his attention returned to me, and suddenly I became very aware of everything again, the dim lighting, the quiet clink of glasses, the faint scent of espresso in the air, but most of all the fact that he was now standing exactly where Jason had been, and the space between us felt entirely different. "May I?" he gestured toward the chair across from me, the same chair that had somehow become the center of everything tonight, and I nodded before I could overthink it, before I could retreat back into the version of myself that always hesitated. He sat down with a calm precision, adjusting the cuff of his sleeve. Like this had always been the plan, like nothing about this moment was accidental. Up close he looked even more composed than I had realized earlier. Dark hair perfectly in place, sharp features softened only slightly by the warm lighting, but it was his eyes that held my attention, steady, focused, not invasive, not dismissive, just present in a way that felt unfamiliar. "You waited an hour," he said, not as a question but as a statement, and I felt a small flicker of embarrassment rise in my chest again. 47 minutes. I corrected quietly, surprising even myself with the response. He tilted his head just slightly, like he was acknowledging the detail, like it mattered. "That is still too long to wait for someone who did not respect your time." His voice remained even, measured, but there was something in the way he said respect that made it feel heavier. Then the word usually did. I looked down at my glass, tracing the edge with my finger. I thought maybe he got stuck in traffic or something came up. I said, and even as I spoke I could hear how weak it sounded, how familiar it sounded, like excuses I had made too many times before. Adrian did not interrupt, did not rush to fill the silence. He simply let it sit between us until I looked up again. People do not forget the things they value, he said finally, and the simplicity of it landed harder than anything complicated could have. I held his gaze for a moment longer than I expected to, like I was trying to understand how someone could say something so direct without sounding harsh, without making it feel like judgment. You do not even know me, I said softly, not defensive, just stating a fact. He leaned back slightly, resting one arm against the back of the chair, his posture relaxed but still controlled. I know enough, he replied. You showed up on time, you gave someone the benefit of the doubt. And you stayed even when you should have left. That tells me more than you think. Something about that made my chest tighten, not in a painful way but in a way that felt unfamiliar, like being seen without having to explain myself, and I was not sure what to do with that feeling. And what does it tell you exactly? I asked before I could stop myself. He studied me for a brief second, not searching, not guessing, just deciding how much to say. That you're patient, he said, but you're using that patience on the wrong people. The words settled quietly between us, and for a moment neither of us spoke. The noise of the restaurant slowly returning around us, like the world had resumed after pausing for a scene only we had been part of. I let out a small breath I had not realized I was holding and glanced toward the entrance where Jason had disappeared earlier, then back at Adrian, who had not moved, who had not rushed, who had simply stayed. And for the first time that night I did not feel like I was the one waiting anymore. I realized I did not know what to do with silence that was not uncomfortable, because for so long silence had meant waiting for something to go wrong, waiting for the next disappointment, waiting for words that would make me question myself again. But this felt different. It felt steady, like it was allowed to exist without needing to be filled. And Adrian did not rush to break it. He simply sat there like he had all the time in the world, like nothing about this moment required urgency. So what happens now? I asked quietly, the question slipping out before I could filter it, because part of me still expected the night to end the same way it always did, with me leaving alone, carrying whatever was left of my pride out into the cold. Adrian's gaze did not waver. That depends on you, he said, and there was no pressure in his tone, no expectation, just a simple truth that somehow felt heavier than anything Jason had ever demanded from me. I let out a small breath, glancing down at the table again, at the condensation ring my glass had left behind, a faint mark, evidence that I had been here waiting for something that never arrived. I think I should probably go, I said finally, even though the words did not feel entirely right, even though something in me hesitated at the idea of walking away from this moment. Adrian nodded once, not stopping me, not convincing me otherwise, just acknowledging the choice. If you leave because you want to, that is one thing, he said. If you leave because you think you should, that is something else. I looked back up at him, feeling that subtle shift again. The way his words did not tell me what to do but made me question why I was doing it. And which one do you think this is? I asked. He did not answer immediately, his eyes studying mine in a way that did not feel invasive, just attentive, like he was waiting for me to reach the conclusion myself. You are still deciding, he said simply, and somehow that felt more honest than anything else I had told myself tonight. A waiter approached, then hesitating just slightly before stepping closer. Mr. Moretti, would you like your usual table prepared? He asked politely, and the way he said the name, the quiet respect in his tone, made something click in my mind. Adrian did not look at the waiter right away, his attention still on me, like my answer mattered more than anything else happening around us. We are fine here, he said calmly, and the waiter nodded before stepping away without another word. And I felt a small flicker of realization settle in my chest, not loud, not dramatic, just a quiet understanding that this had never been a coincidence, not the seat, not the timing, not the way the room had shifted when he walked in. You own this place, I said, the words coming out softer than I expected. Adrian's lips curved slightly, not quite a smile but close enough to soften the edges of his otherwise controlled expression. Among other things, he replied, and there it was again, that subtle weight behind simple words, the sense that there was more beneath the surface, more that he was choosing not to say. I leaned back slightly, absorbing that, letting it settle into everything that had just happened, the way Jason had stepped back, the way the staff had responded, the way Adrian had never needed to raise his voice to be heard. So this really was your seat, I said, and this time there was a hint of something lighter in my tone, something that felt unfamiliar but not unwelcome. Adrian's gaze flickered briefly to the chair, then back to me. Yes, he said, but that is not why I asked him to move. I felt my breath catch slightly at that, not from fear, not from uncertainty, but from the quiet implication behind it. Then why did you? I asked, and for the first time since he had sat down. Adrian leaned forward, just slightly closing the distance between us, not enough to overwhelm, not enough to intrude, just enough to make his next words feel more intentional, more direct, because you were about to accept something you should not have, he said, and the simplicity of it settled into me deeper than anything else had tonight. Not dramatic, not overwhelming, just clear like a line I had not realized I needed someone to draw. And as I sat there looking at him, I understood something else too, something that shifted the weight of the entire evening. I had not stayed because I was weak. I had stayed because I had not yet learned that leaving was also a form of strength. And for the first time I felt like I was starting to learn. For a moment I just sat there letting his words settle into me, because they did not rush past the way most things did. They stayed like they had weight, like they expected to be understood and not just heard. You say that like it is easy, I said quietly, my fingers still resting against the cool surface of the table, grounding myself in something real. Adrian's expression did not change, but there was a subtle shift in his eyes, something that felt almost like recognition. It is not easy, he replied. It is simple, not the same thing. I let out a small breath at that, because he was right, and I hated that he was right. Leaving had always been simple. Technically, you stand up, you walk away, you do not look back. But simple did not mean painless. It did not mean you did not question yourself halfway to the door, wondering if you were the problem, wondering if maybe you should have stayed just a little longer, tried just a little harder. I thought if I gave people enough time, they would eventually show me they cared. I admitted, the words slipping out before I could stop them, and for a second I wondered why I was telling him this, why it felt easier to say it here to someone I had just met than to anyone else. Adrian listened without interrupting, without that polite nod people gave when they were waiting for their turn to speak. He just listened, and somehow that made me keep going. I kept thinking maybe I just needed to be more patient, more understanding, less demanding. I added, my voice softer now, like saying it out loud made it more real, made it harder to ignore. Adrian leaned back slightly, his gaze never leaving mine. And what did that get you? He asked, not unkindly, just directly. I gave a small humorless laugh. Nights like this, I said, gesturing vaguely to the table, to the empty space that had been filled by disappointment not that long ago. Adrian nodded once, like he had expected that answer, like it confirmed something he already knew. Patience is valuable, he said, but only when it is given to someone who earns it. I felt that settle deep in my chest, because it reframed everything. It made patience feel less like something I owed the world and more like something that should be respected. And how do you know who earns it? I asked, because that had always been the part one struggled with the most, the uncertainty, the second-guessing. Adrian's answer came without hesitation. They show up, he said simply, consistently, not just when it is convenient, not just when it benefits them. They show up when it matters. I swallowed at that, thinking about how many times I had excused absence, how many times I had filled in the gaps for people who left them behind, like it was my responsibility to make things whole again. That sounds obvious when you say it like that, I admitted. Adrian's lips curved slightly again, that almost smile that never quite fully appeared. Most truths are, he said, people just complicate them because accepting them requires change. The word change lingered between us heavier than anything else, because it was easy to recognize a pattern. It was harder to break it. I glanced toward the entrance again, not because I expected Jason to come back, but because part of me was still used to watching doors, still used to waiting for something that might or might not happen. Adrian followed my gaze briefly before returning his attention to me. You are not waiting anymore, he said, and it was not a question. I looked back at him, feeling that shift again, stronger this time, more certain. No, I said quietly, and for the first time that night it felt true, not something I was trying to convince myself of, not something I hoped would be true later, but something that already was. Adrian nodded once, like that was all he needed to hear, and then he reached for the menu that had been sitting untouched at the edge of the table since before everything had unfolded. Then you should not leave hungry, he said, placing it gently in front of me, like it was the most natural next step, like the night had not been about waiting at all, but about what came after. And I stared at the menu for a second before letting out a small breath that felt lighter than anything I had felt when I walked in, because maybe this was what it looked like to stop waiting. Not a dramatic exit, not a perfect moment, just a quiet decision to stay where you were valued. And as I picked up the menu and met his eyes again, I realized something else, something that settled into me with unexpected clarity. I had spent so much time hoping someone would choose me that I had forgotten I could choose differently too. The menu felt heavier than it should have, like it carried more than just options. It carried a choice I had not realized I was allowed to make, and for a second I just stared at it, tracing the printed lines without really reading them, because my mind was still catching up to everything that had shifted in the last hour. You do not have to decide right away. Adrian said, his voice steady as ever, like he had already noticed the hesitation I had not even voiced yet. I let out a small breath, almost laughing at myself. It is not the food, I admitted, closing the menu halfway and looking back at him. It is just. I am not used to this. He tilted his head slightly. To what? I searched for the right word and came up short, because it was not just one thing, it was the absence of pressure, the absence of expectation, the absence of that quiet anxiety that usually sat in my chest during moments like this. To not feeling like I have to prove something, I said finally, and the honesty of it lingered between us. Adrian did not react immediately, he just considered it like he did everything else, like he weighed words. Before responding, you are not here to prove anything, he said, you are here because you chose to stay. I swallowed at that because it reframed the entire situation again, shifted the focus away from being evaluated and onto simply existing, and that felt unfamiliar in a way that was both unsettling and comforting at the same time. A waiter approached, then more confident this time, as if whatever uncertainty had been in the air earlier had settled. Can I bring you something to drink, he asked, and I opened my mouth to respond but hesitated, glancing briefly at Adrian out of habit before catching myself, before reminding myself I did not need permission. Adrian noticed that too. I could see it in the slight change in his expression, not disapproval, not amusement, just awareness. Water is fine, I said, turning back to the waiter, and he nodded before stepping away again, leaving us in that steady quiet that no longer felt uncomfortable. You almost asked me what you should order, Adrian said after a moment, not accusing, just stating what had nearly happened. I felt my cheeks warm slightly because he was right, and I hated how automatic that instinct had been. I know, I admitted, it is a habit. He leaned back slightly, folding his hands loosely in front of him. Habits are just decisions you have repeated often enough that they feel automatic, he said. They can be changed the same way. I looked at him, considering that because it sounded simple, again too simple, but I was starting to understand that simple did not mean easy, it just meant clear. And what about you? I asked, shifting the focus slightly. Do you always step into situations like that? I gestured subtly toward where Jason had been earlier. Adrian's gaze did not waver. No, he said simply. Then why did you tonight? I pressed, and for the first time there was a brief pause, not hesitation, but choice, like he was deciding how much to reveal. Because you did not deserve that, he said finally, and the directness of it caught me off guard more than anything else had tonight, not because of what he said, but because of how easily he said it, like it was obvious, like it did not require explanation. I looked down for a second, processing that, letting it settle in a place that had been used to hearing the opposite for far too long. You make it sound simple again, I murmured. Adrian's response came just as calmly as before. It is simple, he said. People complicate worth because it gives them an excuse to ignore it. I felt that land deeper than I expected, because it challenged something I had accepted for years, the idea that worth had to be earned, that it could be negotiated, adjusted based on someone else's opinion. And you do not do that? I asked quietly. He shook his head once. No, he said, I decide what I tolerate and what I do not, and I act accordingly. There was something steady about that, something unshakable that made it feel less like confidence and more like certainty, and for a moment I just watched him, taking in the way he spoke, the way he held himself, the way he did not seem to question his own boundaries, and I realized that was the real difference. Not the restaurant, not the power, not the way people responded to him. It was the fact that he did not wait for others to define what he deserved. He had already decided, and as I sat there with the menu still in my hands, I felt something shift again, not all at once, not dramatically, just a quiet adjustment in the way I saw myself, the way I understood what I was allowed to expect. And for the first time that night, the idea of staying did not feel like settling, it felt like choosing. The water arrived first, cool and clear, the condensation forming slowly along the glass as the waiter placed it gently in front of me, and for some reason that small detail grounded me more than anything else had tonight. Something simple, something present, something that did not carry expectation. I wrapped my fingers around it, letting the chill settle into my skin before taking a small sip, and when I set it back down I realized my hands were no longer shaking. Adrian noticed that too, I could tell by the way his gaze flickered briefly to the glass and then back to my face, not questioning, not commenting, just observing, like he was cataloging changes I had not fully recognized yet. Better, he said quietly, and it was not really a question. I nodded once. Yeah, I admitted, better, and for the first time that word felt accurate, not forced, not something I said to make other people comfortable, just true. The menu still sat in front of me, and this time when I opened it I actually read it, scanning the options, letting myself consider what I wanted instead of what I thought I should choose. What do you usually recommend? I asked, then catching myself halfway through the sentence and letting out a small breath. No, actually I want to try the salmon, I corrected before he could answer, and there was something small but significant about that shift, something that made me sit a little straighter. Adrian's expression changed just slightly again, that almost smile returning. Good choice, he said simply, and the approval in his tone did not feel like validation, it felt like acknowledgement, like I had made a decision, and that was enough. The waiter returned shortly after and I placed my order without hesitation, without glancing back at Adrian, without second-guessing it, and when the waiter left again I felt a quiet sense of accomplishment that would have seemed ridiculous an hour ago, but now felt real. You see, Adrian said, leaning back slightly. Not difficult. I let out a soft laugh, shaking my head. It is not the ordering that is difficult, I replied, it is everything behind it. He nodded once, like he understood exactly what I meant, like he had seen this pattern before in other people, or maybe even in himself at some point. Confidence is not about big decisions, he said. It is built in small ones like that, repeated over time until they become natural. I considered that, letting it settle in the same way his other words had, because it made sense. It made change feel less overwhelming, less like something I had to accomplish all at once, and more like something I could build step by step. So what you are saying is I should start with ordering my own dinner and work my way up, I said with a slight hint of humor, and this time Adrian's smile appeared fully brief but unmistakable. It is a solid beginning, he replied. The moment lingered longer than I expected. Not awkward, not forced, just quiet and steady, like we had found a rhythm without trying, and for the first time that night I allowed myself to relax into it fully, not waiting for something to go wrong, not scanning for signs that this would shift into something familiar and disappointing, but simply being present in it. You are not what I expected, I said after a moment, the words coming out softer than I intended. Adrian raised an eyebrow slightly. And what did you expect? He asked. I thought about that for a second, about the way he carried himself, the way the room responded to him, the way his name had been spoken with quiet respect earlier. Someone more. I hesitated, searching for the right word. Intimidating, I finished. He tilted his head slightly, considering that. And I am not, he asked. I met his gaze steadily this time, not looking away, not shrinking under the intensity of it. You are, I said honestly, but not in the way I thought. Something shifted in his expression at that, something subtle, something that suggested I had said something he did not hear often. But he did not press for clarification, he did not ask me to explain, he simply accepted it the same way he had accepted everything else tonight, without complication, without unnecessary words. And as I sat there across from him, waiting for a meal I had chosen, in a moment I had decided to stay, and I realized something else, something that felt quieter than everything that had come before. But just as important, I was not just reacting anymore, I was participating, and that difference, however small it seemed, changed everything. The food arrived with a quiet efficiency that matched everything else about the evening. The plate placed gently in front of me, the scent of lemon and herbs rising just enough to feel warm and real, and for a moment I simply looked at it, not because I had never seen a meal like this before, but because this time it felt different. This time it felt like something I had chosen, not something I had settled for. Adrian's plate followed shortly after, and the waiter stepped away without interruption, leaving us again in that steady rhythm that no longer felt unfamiliar. You were right, I said after a moment, picking up my fork. This was a good choice. Adrian gave a small nod. You trusted your own decision, he replied, and I realized he was not talking about the food. Not really. I took a bite, letting the flavors settle before responding, because for once I was not rushing to fill the silence, I was letting it exist alongside everything else. I think I have spent a long time second-guessing myself, I admitted, my voice quieter now, but steadier than before. Adrian rested his hand lightly against the table, his posture unchanged, but his attention fully on me. Second-guessing usually starts when someone teaches you not to trust your own judgment, he said, and I felt that land deeper than I expected, because it connected things I had never fully put together before. The small moments, the dismissals, the times I had been told I was overthinking or overreacting, until eventually I stopped trusting my own instincts altogether. It is easier to believe someone else knows better, I said slowly, more to myself than to him. Adrian shook his head slightly. It is easier in the moment, he corrected, but it costs more over time. I looked up at that, meeting his gaze, and there was no pressure in it, no expectation, just that same steady presence that had been there since the beginning of this night. You talk like you learned all of this the hard way, I said. Adrian's expression shifted just enough to suggest there was truth in that, but he did not elaborate, not directly. Everyone learns it one way or another, he replied, and something about the way he said it made me understand that his path had not been simple either, that whatever certainty he carried now had been built, not given. We ate in a comfortable, quiet For a few minutes, the kind that did not feel like avoidance but like space, like both of us were allowing the conversation to breathe instead of forcing it forward, and for the first time in a long time I noticed I was not checking my phone, I was not watching the door, I was not waiting for anything else to interrupt this moment, I was just there fully present, and that realization felt bigger than anything else that had happened tonight. "Can I ask you something?" I said, setting my fork down. Adrian nodded. "Once you can ask," he said, not promising an answer, just allowing the question. "Do you always step in like that?" I asked again, but this time the question carried more weight, more curiosity than before. Adrian considered it briefly. "No," he said simply. "Then why me?" The question came out softer than I intended, but I did not take it back because I wanted to understand. I needed to understand. Adrian's gaze held mine steady, not intense, not overwhelming, just direct. "Because you did not ask for help," he said, and I felt my breath pause slightly at that, not because I expected a different answer, but because I had not expected that one. "What does that mean?" I asked. He leaned forward just slightly, his voice still calm, still measured. "People who expect to be saved behave differently," he said. "They look around, they signal, they wait for someone to step in. You did not do that. You stayed, you handled it, you only pulled back when it mattered." I processed that slowly, letting each word settle into place because it reframed something again, something I had always seen as weakness, something I had quietly criticized myself for. "So you stepped in because I did not ask you to," I said. Adrian nodded once. "Yes," he replied, "because that tells me you would not rely on it." I sat back slightly, absorbing that because it felt like the opposite of everything I had been taught to expect. The idea that someone would step in not because I needed them to, but because I did not depend on it. And for the first time that night I understood something else, something that shifted the way I saw him, the way I saw this moment entirely. He had not taken control to own it, he had stepped in to change the outcome and then let me decide what came next, and that difference mattered more than anything else. The conversation did not end the way I expected it to, because for once I was not watching for the moment it would fall apart. I was not preparing for disappointment, I was simply there, and that changed everything. The plates had been cleared at some point. I barely noticed when it happened because I had been too focused on the quiet steadiness of the moment. On the way, time did not feel like something slipping away, but something I was actually experiencing. Adrian sat across from me exactly as he had from the beginning, composed, controlled, present, and I realized something that surprised me more than anything else. I was not intimidated anymore, not in the way I had been when he first spoke, not in the way I had been with Jason. I was aware of him, yes, aware of the weight he carried, of the way the room subtly adjusted around him, but I was not shrinking under it. "You are different now," Adrian said, and it took me a second to realize he meant me. I let out a small breath, glancing down at my hands resting calmly on the table. No tension, no tight grip, just stillness. "I feel different," I admitted, because that was the only way to describe it. Not dramatic, not overwhelming, just a quiet shift that made everything else feel clearer. Adrian nodded once, like that was expected, like change was not something surprising but something inevitable when you finally saw things the way they were. "What happens when you walk out of here?" he asked, and the question settled between us heavier than anything else had tonight, because it was not about the moment, it was about what came after. I thought about it, really thought about it, instead of defaulting to the version of myself that would have tried to give the right answer, the safe answer. "I do not go back to what I was accepting before," I said slowly, choosing each word carefully because I wanted it to be true, not just something that sounded right. Adrian's gaze held mine steady, not testing, not doubting, just listening. "And if it is harder than you expect?" he asked. I shook my head slightly. "It will be," I said honestly. "But that does not mean it is wrong." Something in his expression shifted at that, subtle but real, like he recognized the difference between someone repeating an idea and someone actually understanding it. "Good," he said simply, and that single word felt more solid than any long speech could have been, because it was not approval, it was acknowledgement. Again, that quiet recognition that I had reached something on my own. The check appeared shortly after, placed discreetly at the edge of the table, and instinctively I reached for it, stopping myself halfway through before glancing at Adrian. He did not move, did not reach for it either, just watched me with that same calm attention, like he was waiting to see what I would do. I picked it up, looked at it, and for a brief second the old instinct flickered, the hesitation, the question of what was expected of me. But then I set it back down just as calmly. "You invited me to stay," I said, meeting his gaze directly. "So I am going to let you decide that part." Adrian studied me for a moment, longer than usual, and then that almost smile returned, but this time there was something warmer in it, something less guarded. "Fair," he said, reaching for the check without hesitation, like the